Thank you for attending this afternoon. My name is Corwin Scott. I am the Title VI Program Lead here at WSDOT in the Office of Equal Opportunity. And I am joined today by Alberto, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Corwin. Alberto Valentin, Environmental Justice and Community Engagement Manager of the Office of Equal Opportunity, in charge of Title VI Compliance, Environmental Justice, and now also the HEAL Act implementation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Alberto. And Alberto and I are both joined today by Anthony. Anthony, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Yes, my name is Anthony Pheasant. I'm the Title VI and Equity Analyst. And thank you all for joining us today. I have included in the chat a link to our anonymous survey as part of our federal requirements and efforts in collecting demographic data. So if you do have a moment, please feel free to fill out this voluntary and completely anonymous survey. And we greatly appreciate your participation, so thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Anthony. Today we are going to cover the Title VI program, environmental justice practices, and limited English proficiency protocols. Just a bit of housekeeping. In today's training, we will include a Q&A session at the end of the PowerPoint. This time has been reserved for questions, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, please feel free to type them in the chat box and we will go over those one by one at the end of the presentation. During this presentation, we will be covering Title VI, environmental justice, and limited English proficiency. But we will also cover collecting the demographic data and how that data applies to our Title VI program here at the Office of Equal Opportunity and to your divisions. When we talk about discrimination, please be aware that there are different types of discrimination that we will be referring to. The first is intentional discrimination. Intentional discrimination is the denial of any service, financial aid, or benefit provided under a program to which an individual may otherwise be entitled. There are different standards or requirements for participation, segregation, or separate treatment in any part of the program. The second one is disparate impact, which means neutral laws or procedures that have the effect of discrimination against protected classes. For example, let's say that an employer uses testing tools to screen applicants, but the tool unfairly identifies a significant portion of women as unsuccessful candidates. Women applicants may claim discrimination based on sex and challenge the validity of the test. Employers would have to prove it was a job necessity and job related. Women may still be able to show an employer declined to adopt alternative employment processes with less adverse impact on women. Another form of discrimination is retaliation. A retaliation against an individual for bringing discrimination claims, participating in investigations, or opposing practices. A retaliation claim may stand on its own regardless of the merit of the underlying discrimination claim. It's important to remember that there are multiple protected classes or groups that benefit from protection by federal law that are outside of Title VI. But WSDOT adheres to these federal laws and seeks to ensure that all Title VI related acts and executive orders are being applied. A claim is related on how a person has been denied certain rights based on being a member of a group. The Title VI classes include race, color, national origin, and limited English proficiency by court order. However, there are additional classes that do not apply to Title VI, and they are sex and gender, individuals with disabilities, age, and this applies to delivery of benefits or services at any age, a religious freedom and religion, and finally, low income and minorities. When a person needs to submit a complaint under Title VI, they can only submit a complaint based on race, color, and national origin. However, they have the alternative to submit a complaint through the Office of Equal Opportunity when the discrimination is based on any of the other unprotected classes. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1987 extends this to apply to all programs and activities of federal aid recipients, subrecipients, and contractors. What this means is that first, Title VI applies to the entire institution or entity, which means all of its programs and activities. If any part of the entity or institution is receiving any of the federal funds. For example, if a certain division was the only program in WSDOT that was receiving federal assistance, the entire agency must comply with Title VI. Additionally, if a separate WSDOT program, such as communications, had subrecipients, then those subrecipients would be subject to Title VI practices as well. As a federal assistance recipient, you must ensure you are taking the appropriate steps to ensure non-discrimination in your programs and activities. Remember that Title VI extends to every aspect of the organization. This includes planning to project development, right-of-way, safety, and community engagement. I will now hand the floor over to Alberto for the environmental justice portion.
Thank you, Corwin. So, in order to start talking about environmental justice, it is important to talk a little bit about the background of this term and how it was created, or actually how it exists. So in the early 90s, minorities, low-income communities, vulnerable populations, underrepresented communities, for the first time in history, started use Title VI complaint from the Civil Rights Act. These procedures to address racial discrimination and environmental races against facilities and projects from public institutions that were causing in some way environmental effects and health disparities. After years of these complaints and community outreach, lobbying, activism from communities, the White House approved in 1994 the Executive Order 12-A98 that established for the first time the term of environmental justice. And why is that? Well, because Title VI complaint was not the most efficient tool available back then to actually address the possible discrimination through environmental effects and health disparities that these communities had. The only way that a person can submit a Title VI against an agency is that they need to demonstrate that an actual discrimination against these communities happened through a project or an activity. So it was very hard to actually demonstrate through Title VI that an environmental effect or a health disparity caused by in our case, a transportation project was actually an intentional discrimination process. So that's why in 1994, the Executive Order 12898 was established to address these health disparities and these environmental effects caused by transportation activities. So to achieve environmental justice through Executive Order 12898 for federal compliance, WSDOT has, as a federal subrecipient, to promote no discrimination in programs that affect human health and environment, provide minority and low-income communities access to public participation and information, identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects over these populations through our programs, policies, and activities. And conducting data analysis, demographic analysis, over the affected populations on specific areas or locations where WSDOT is going to perform a specific activity or project. Next slide, please. So environmental justice, whether intentional or not, can have large negative impacts on low-income communities and vulnerable populations in Washington state, resulting in severe chronic health issues and environmental destruction as well, such as asthma cases, heat exhaustion, air and water pollution, and the destruction of natural resources, among others. So evidence of transportation disparities, environmental injustice, and systematic racism include, for example, the prevalence of highways in, through, and around low-income neighborhoods, resulting in heightened exposure to air pollutants, air quality hotspots existing in neighborhoods close to freeways, for example, inner city children experiencing disproportionately incident of asthma, adverse environmental health effects caused by transportation activities include vibration, air noise, water pollution, and cell contamination, destruction and or disruption of natural resources, community cohesion, community economic vitality, adverse employment effects, among other things. And these are some of the many reasons why we must enforce, as a public institution, as a transportation public institution, environmental justice compliance to amplify minority and low-income voices in the decision-making process, improving community engagement and public outreach through these populations and through these communities, and ensuring that these communities and population have an active role and participation during the development of the Transportation Department's general plans. We need to understand that one of the main reasons why our nationwide and statewide public activities in so many occasions have resulted in this discrimination and these disparities is because when we are supposed to do community engagement and public outreach activities, we don't do that extra effort to engage with these particular populations. We don't see too much diversity and inclusion in our community engagement activities. We don't reach out people with limited English proficiency. We don't do that extra effort to engage with Indian countries, or we don't engage we don't do enough efforts to engage with these particular populations that in some cases don't have the resources or don't trust in so many ways maybe the public institutions. So we need to do an extra effort to engage with them. So that's one of the main reasons why we in some ways over the decades, we have promoting discrimination actions over these communities because they don't participate in the process. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here is a list of few general considerations we should think about before starting any project regarding Title VI and environmental justice. While EJ principles enforce in some way the same goals as Title VI, Executive Order 12-898 does not create legally enforceable rights or obligations, including any right for judicial review for non-compliance that communities have to submit against public institutions, for example, like WSDOT in this case. This means that if a person believes that a transportation activity caused by WSDOT has caused or might cause a disproportionate human health and or environmental effect, they don't have any legal course of action that they can follow, unfortunately. That's not the case that we have with Title VI. People that feel that they have been discriminated by WSDOT or any other public institution that receive federal financial assistance through or because of the race or their color or the national origin, or because they have certain limitation understanding English, they can submit a Title VI complaint against these public institutions and also go to federal institutions, like in our case, Federal Highway, DOT, to also submit a Title VI complaint against WSDOT. However, there are many types of Title VI complaints that also involve or can involve EJ principles or EJ assessments. For example, let's say we have a transportation project that involves an area with minorities and people or individuals with limited English proficiency living in the area. We provide different types of public involvement during the processes, but we do not provide any type of language assistance such as translations or translators or interpreters. So people with limited English proficiency living in the area were not able to meaningful participate in these activities that we hold as community engagement activities or public outreach activities, open houses, or any kind of a public activity or public outreach activity that we do to engage with these communities. So while Title VI does not require us to do a demographic analysis to identify these minorities that are going to be possibly affected by our activities, Environmental Justice Executive Order 1298 does. And we will use the EJ analysis to identify minorities and also including individuals with limited English proficiency. Although we can only use race, color, or national origin to be able to submit a complaint under Title VI, national origin of Title VI has extended limited English proficiency through the court's decisions. Therefore, if a person demonstrates that we, WSDOT, did not provide equal opportunity because of their national origin, in this case, a limitation to understand English during a public decision, in this case, a community engagement activity, that person can challenge the process that WSDOT had using the information that we gathered using an environmental assessment. So, to summarize, a person that is not able to submit a complaint of environmental justice, but is able to submit a Title VI complaint. And over the years, courts and federal institutions have used the information that we have gathered in environmental assessment to sustain the arguments that an individual have when they submit a Title VI complaint against a public institution. Next slide, please. So, an environmental justice analysis is done for each project to avoid, minimize, or mitigate disproportionately high and adverse human health and environmental effects over minorities, low-income populations, vulnerable populations, and underrepresented communities. And it is a requirement for all projects where an environmental assessment is required under the National Environmental Policy Act of the United States. During this review process, we are supposed to do an environmental justice assessment, which is basically identify the demographics living in the area, understand if in this area where the project is going to happen, we have environmental justice protected populations, and once we identify them, and once we identify and understand using demographic tools what are the necessities, the struggles, and the different health concerns of these populations, we need to do a community engagement with these particular populations. So to conduct an environmental justice analysis, you need also, again, you need to identify and know the community, the social economic aspects of their communities from the affected area or the project is going to happen, the demographics, and understand who may be impacted by a project. Then engage with them to figure out a sustainable solution. It is important that these communities, these environmental justice protected populations, understand what are the possible effects of our projects in the future. So we need to do an extra effort to engage with these particular populations. And why is that? Because over the decades, we haven't done enough to involve these populations and these communities in the decision-making process, bring it to the table, discuss with them, make them understand what is going to happen in their communities. So to do this, we must ensure the full and fair participation in the transportation decision-making process from all vulnerable population. So let's go over each step of this process in the following. Next slide, please. So what populations we are supposed to identify? We talk about vulnerable populations, we talk about underrepresented communities, we talk about minorities, and we talk about low-income populations as well. We need to understand that even though the Executive Order 1298 was created in 1994, Washington has already passed a new legislation that require WSDOT and 6 other departments, public departments, to enforce also for the state level compliance environmental justice principles. And now this new legislation has expanded in some way the protected populations over environmental justice. We're talking right now about federal compliance. So according to the Executive Order 1298 and the following regulations approved after the Executive Order 1298, these are the minority populations that are protected by this executive order. Black or African American, Hispanics or Latinos, Asian, American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. Also, this is not a limited list. Minority populations can include a diverse plethora of other communities and populations living in Washington state as well, that also are protected by the Executive Order 1298. Federal Highway and DOT define low income as having a medium household income at or below the poverty level. Even though we are not going to cover this subject today again, but a recent state law from Washington state that I mentioned before, the HEAL Act, have, as I mentioned, expanded the populations protected under environmental justice to include a wide variety of vulnerable populations and underrepresented communities to protect their quality of life through the public decision process that we have. Next slide, please. Thank you. So once environmental justice populations have been identified, we are supposed to determine if there are any adverse possible effects over these EJ populations in the area where our activity is going to happen. So environmental justice, whether, as I mentioned before, intentional or not, can have large negative impacts on populations, including environmental effects like pollution and health disparities, like asthma, but also social economic impacts. We need to understand that when we are doing an environmental justice assessment during NEPA reviews, we are also responsible to understand the social economic impacts that the populations living in the area are suffering. We need to use demographic tools like the one available in the Department of Health, the Environmental Health Disparity Map tool, to understand the different necessities from these communities. Household income, how many individuals live under poverty levels in the area, how many people, how many individuals do not have or do not own a private car, for asthma cases, heart attacks. Why is that? Because we need to understand that our decision, our public transportation decision is going to affect not only the quality of life, but also the social economic lifestyle of these communities as well. And we need to pay attention when we are doing environmental assessment to understand all these impacts as well. Once we know who makes up the community in the project area, we determine if any of them will be impacted by environmental or other effects. This can include temporary construction or even long-term operational type effects, such as noise from pile driving next to someone's residence, and a detour is long in duration or time that may or may not reroute traffic away from local businesses, for example, or cut off access to mobility or medical services. There's plenty of possibilities that we need to explore when we are doing an environmental assessment of the possible impacts that these communities are going to suffer. We need to be very comprehensive and understand that we are working about the lifestyle of and the quality of life of these communities. Next slide, please. So once we have identified the adverse effects, the possible adverse effects over EJ populations from the area, we need to determine if these adverse effects is a disproportionately adverse health or environmental effect over these populations. If the negative effect predominantly borne by the minority or low-income population, or is a minority and or low-income population being negatively affected more than the non-minority or no low-income population. That is how are the negative impacts from the projects distributed. What does it mean? Well, when we are doing an analysis of the possible impacts of our projects or activities over the communities living in the area, we need to do a balance. We need to understand if environmental justice protected populations are going or are already suffering specific burdens caused by environmental effects and health disparities. And if our decision is going to put an extra burden over the already disparities that these communities are suffering in comparison to other populations that maybe are not protected by environmental justice practices, general populations or wealthier populations. We need to understand and we need to do a balance of analysis and determine if our decision is the best decision according to the necessities and the disparities that these communities are suffering already from the area. Next slide, please. So in order to determine disproportionately high and adverse effects, we must review and analyze the data. As an example, this table demonstrates a disproportionate impact on the Hispanic Latino population. From this, we can see that this Hispanic Latino group has the highest portion of an adversely affected persons compared to other groups, even though they are not the largest population. We will need to reach out to the impacted community members to see how we can avoid, minimize, or mitigate for the impact. What does this mean? This means that probably this group that we have identified of Latinos and Hispanic communities are maybe we have people that doesn't speak English, or maybe has certain limitation to understand English. So we need to step forward and we need probably to translate our invitation to our public meetings and also probably provide an interpreter. But let me go forward. Let me also talk about this. I'm Hispanic. I'm Latino. But we know we need and the Hispanic and Latino community is a big community growing up in the United States and in Washington State. But we also have other communities and other national regions communities that also have certain limitation speaking English. So when we are doing an analysis of the demographics living in the area, we need to make sure that we understand how many people with limited English proficiency living in the area are not only Hispanic. Maybe we have a Russian community. Maybe we have a Vietnamese. Maybe we have Arabic communities. So we need to make sure we have translated our documents and our invitations, and we have provided enough interpreters for our public for our public meetings or public hearings. So all these communities that have certain limitation with English can understand what is happening in the location. Next slide, please. So as part of environmental justice, we must promote full and fair participation within our workplace. In order to do so, we need to ensure that we are reaching out to the public, including any local civil rights groups or organizations, and their participation and involvement is part of all phases in any project, including planning, designing, and implementation as well. By doing so, this allows us to recognize and communicate the needs and interests of all participants and ensure the involvement in any project or activity. We must also educate ourselves in cultural competency of the necessity of different cultures and different demographics. I always like to give my example. I am Hispanic, I am a Puerto Rican. My necessities, my understanding of the necessity of the Hispanic community, for example, living in Washington State, are not the same understanding that maybe the Hispanic and these Latino communities have in Washington State. I didn't go through the same processes. I didn't go through the same struggles or the necessities. So myself as a public employee and also as a Hispanic and Puerto Rican, I need to understand and educate myself in cultural competence about the necessities of the other cultures, even though I am a Latino or a Hispanic person. Next slide, please. So community engagement and environmental justice go hand in hand in all stages of any project or activity. So our goal is early and often, which includes and is essential in having community engagement in the planning phase. For example, the lack of doing an effective environmental justice assessment and community engagement and identify the populations living in the area and meaningfully involve them in the process can result, for example, in the relocation during a right-of-way process of an underrepresented and vulnerable family that didn't participate in the decision-making process. A family that in comparison, maybe, to another family or community is already experiencing an overburden caused by environmental effects or health disparities. So this is one of the several reasons why we need to involve all populations and communities in the decision-making process and make sure they have a voice in this decision-making process. We can collect demographic information. We can review demographic information using the amazing demographic tools that we have out there. But if we don't engage one by one, face to face with these communities, or at least we reach out particular organizations that represent the interests of these communities and these populations, we cannot understand the real necessities of these communities, even though we have the best demographic information collected by demographic tools available out there. Next slide, please. So we need to do an effective analysis of the social economic condition of the population from the area, to do a balance of interests and determine that our decision won't cause an extra burden to a community that is already suffering discrimination or a disproportionate effect. So as we stated before, environmental justice is a component of Title VI, consisting of both similarities and differences between the two of both. Title VI and environmental justice are similar in many ways, such as the protection of minority population and their equal involvement in all WSDOT projects decisions, and the development of policy and activities. They are essential in our agency and should be applied and adhere to all our aspects of our work. However, environmental justice and Title VI, even though they have to be enforced at the same time, they have different goals. Title VI has the intention to avoid and eradicate any kind of discrimination based on race, color, national origin, and individuals with limited English proficiency when we are providing any kind of service. We need to make sure that when we are providing any kind of service, we are involving with all communities and we are not discriminating because of the race, color, and national origin and individual with limited proficiency. On the other hand, environmental justice has the intention to avoid, eradicate, or mitigate environmental effects or health disparities over EJ protected populations by identifying these protected populations and doing a meaningful involvement with these communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. And now I'm going to go over to limited English proficiency. So as we stated before, environmental justice is a component of the Title VI, consisting of both similarities and differences between the two. So Title VI environmental justice are similar in many ways, such as the protection of minority populations and their equal involvement in all of WSDOT's project planning, development, policies, and activities. They are essential in our agency and should be applied and adhered to in all aspects of our work. So Executive Order 13166 was established as an extension of our Title VI under national origin in order to improve access to services for persons with limited English proficiency. So who are LEP persons, or limited English proficient persons or individuals? They're individuals who do not speak English as his or her primary language and have a limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. This includes people who reported to the U.S. Census that they do not speak English well or at all. As a federal aid recipient, we must ensure that LEP persons have meaningful access to our program services and information. So this includes providing certified interpreters when needed and using qualified translation services for vital documents and web pages, as well as ensuring our staff are trained in utilizing methods such as four-factor analysis to determine the necessary steps to provide meaningful access to LEP persons. We're going to go over the four-factor analysis here on the next slide. To help ensure LEP persons have meaningful access, a four-factor analysis must be applied to each of our programs and activities. The first factor will be to determine the number, portion, and languages of LEP persons served in the affected area. So Washington State, for example, has an LEP population of over 7.7% with an English proficiency level that could impede the ability to access services. For the second factor, you'll want to determine how often LEP individuals come into contact with our programs, activities, and services. The more frequent the contact with a particular language group, the more likely that service in that language is needed. Such as for Washington State, the highest accessibility service demand is for 7 languages, which includes Spanish, Russian, Vietnamese, Korean, Chinese, Somali, and Arabic. The third factor, you will need to determine whether denial or delay of access to your services or information could have serious or even life-threatening implications for the LEP individual. So this means we need to develop procedures to provide language assistance to LEP individuals by reaching out to community organizations that serve individuals to determine the importance of each program, service, or activity to the lives of these individuals. And then for the fourth factor, WSDOT should, on a case-by-case basis, identify the most cost-effective means of delivering timely, accurate, and effective language services to LEP individuals. If language services to these individuals in any given instance are to be limited, WSDOT must be prepared to document the reason why WSDOT is not or was not able to provide such services. So all vital documents, such as complaint forms, notification of rights, and accessing services or benefits, must be translated into languages that meet the LEP threshold of 5% of the total population or 1,000 individuals, whichever is less, in the affected area. So here we just provided 2 examples of vital documents, such as documents critical for accessing recipients, services or benefits, informing customers of free language assistance, and complaint forms. And just as an FYI, we currently have our complaint forms translated into 17 different languages. And as part of our annual report to the Federal Highway Administration and to ensure we are adhering to Title VI in environmental justice, we must continually collect, analyze, and document demographic data to determine the LEP population and to measure any disparate impacts on a population in a project's affected area. To collect this type of data, we'll need to use approved sources, such as the Washington Environmental Health Disparities Map, United States Census, EJ Screen surveys. Additional sources will be provided in an upcoming slide. Please remember that anytime you are providing outreach to the public, whether directly, such as through community engagement forums, meetings, or residential visits, or indirectly, such as social media platforms or website postings, you should be collecting demographic data. Once collected, you'll need to review and analyze the data to determine any LEP populations meeting the threshold, such as determining the ratio of the number of individuals who speak English not very well in the language they speak at home and comparing that to the total population. Remember, anytime you're collecting and analyzing demographic data, be sure to document and keep records of that information in your efforts. The first step to collect data to see if there is an LEP population present in the program area, in the project area. One of the various sources you may use is the US Census data, which we mentioned before. So as in the example shown here, once you select your area from the census data, you'll be able to filter out the populations that speak English less than very well. In analyzing the given demographic data, demographics shown here, the LEP population in this project area for Spanish speaking exceeds the threshold of 1,000 individuals, and we would need to translate any vital documents into that language and any other language identified meeting the LEP threshold in the project's area. For an additional approved secondary source of information, you may use the Washington State Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, OSPI's website. So for example, when there's more than one elementary school in city limits, you can calculate the percentage of the students. So in here, for example, we have school A has 3% Vietnamese speaking students with 500 total students. School B has 4% Vietnamese with 550 total students, and School C has 1% Vietnamese speaking with 475 total students. So here the sum of Vietnamese speaking students out of the total students is 1,520 students. So it is roughly 3% of the total population. However, it still meets the 1,000-person threshold, which this would trigger vital documents to be translated. And as a reference for you, here is a list of sources you may use to conduct your analysis. Just remember that when collecting data, collecting demographic data, the data needs to directly relate to the specific processes of the program area. Describe what data is being collected, how it's collected, and how it is analyzed. Calling back to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Anthony. That was awesome. Our Title VI program, working with our liaisons, is responsible for ensuring Title VI, including environmental justice and limited English proficiency guidelines, are administered through our WSDOT. This includes internal, which are our divisions and offices throughout WSDOT, and external, such as the local planning agencies, the metropolitan planning organizations, and the regional transportation planning organizations. There are responsibilities such as providing guidance, training, and technical assistances as well. Additionally, some of our key roles include internal, external reviews, submitting annual goals and accomplishments reports, a Title VI implementation plan, and some assurances, and ensuring dissemination of Title VI information. The annual goals and accomplishments report is provided to the Federal Highway Administration each year by October 1st. This report provides the Federal Highway Administration with information and documentation of your efforts over the past year in implementing Title VI. A few examples are listed here of possible accomplishments you may provide, such as review of internal programs for Title VI requirements along with results and actions taken, Title VI related trainings attended, and environmental justice related trainings attended. Some examples of possible goals you may want to report can include internal reviews planned for the coming year, increase outreach to environmental justice populations, and improve your data collection efforts. Next slide, please. welcome, Anthony. Thank you. To support our Title VI program in collecting information related to Title VI in all of WSDOT's divisions and program areas. This is to ensure that our policies, programs, and activities are inclusive and non-discriminatory. Each division and region will have specific roles and responsibilities updated each year and distributed to each division and region regarding Title VI. The Title VI liaisons assigned to the division or region will review these responsibilities and work with the Title VI specialist throughout the year in completing these tasks and reporting out on the annual goal accomplishments report. WSDOT's implementation plan is a tool to ensure that we are in accordance with federal civil rights laws. This plan provides additional detail of our Title VI program and how each division, program, area is applying Title VI. This plan is submitted annually to the Federal Highway Administration and can be found on our website. In order to provide adequate community engagement, we must adhere to federal and state rules, the regulations, and guidelines. Here we have listed out related federal and state requirements along with WSDOT's policies, plans, and related information as an additional resource. We should be aware of how important it is to ensure we are complying with Title VI and environmental justice and the severe effects of non-compliance has on our communities. It is also important to remember that in the event of a contractor's non-compliance with the non-discrimination provisions of their contract, the contract owner will impose such contract sanctions as it or the Federal Highway Administration may determine to be appropriate, including, but not limited to, withholding of payments to the recipient under the contract until the recipient complies and/or cancellation, termination, or suspension of a contract in whole and part. Thank you for attending this presentation. As an additional reference and resource, we have included our contact information for our program, as well as links to related information that you may use to help assist you with Title VI and environmental justice. Please feel free to use these resources or contact us if you have any questions around Title VI, limited English proficiency, and environmental justice. We will now begin our Q&A.